At 12:15 in the morning on July 30, 1945, two violent explosions tore through the darkness of the Philippine Sea. A column of fire shot into the night sky, illuminating the calm waters for miles around. The first blast blew the bow completely off the ship. The second ripped through the hull amidships, igniting ammunition magazines and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. Sailors, sleeping in their bunks, were thrown from their beds. Men on watch were hurled across the deck by the shockwave. Those below decks found themselves suddenly trapped in flooding compartments as seawater poured through massive holes in the hull. The heavy cruiser, USS Indianapolis, one of the most decorated warships in the United States Navy, had just been dealt a fatal blow. In 12 minutes, she would be gone. And nearly 900 men would be left floating in shark-infested waters, where they would remain for almost 4 days before anyone realized they were missing. USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, the second and final ship of her class after her sister ship USS Portland. Her keel was laid on March 31, 1930, at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. She was launched on November 7, 1931, and commissioned on November 15, 1932, at Philadelphia Navy Yard under Captain John Smealy. The ship measured 610 feet in overall length, with a beam of approximately 66 feet and a mean draft of 17 feet. Her standard displacement was approximately 9,950 long tons, while her full load displacement reached over 12,750 long tons. She was designed for both speed and firepower, a combination that would serve her well through years of combat in the Pacific. 4 Parsons-geared turbines powered by 8 White Forster boilers drove 4 propeller shafts, generating 107,000 shaft horsepower. This gave Indianapolis a design speed of 32 knots, though she achieved 32.7 knots on sea trials, making her one of the fastest heavy cruisers in the fleet. Her range was 10,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, allowing her to operate across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. Her main armament consisted of 9 8-inch guns, arranged in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward in a super-firing arrangement and 1 aft. She also carried 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns for defense against enemy aircraft. By 1945, her anti-aircraft suite had been significantly upgraded to include 24 40mm Bofors guns in 6 quad mounts and approximately 19 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Armor protection included a belt ranging from 3¼ to 5 inches thick around her magazines, 2.5-inch deck armor, and bulkheads between 2 and 5 3/4 inches thick. Beyond her impressive specifications, Indianapolis held a special place in American naval history. She had served as a presidential vessel, embarking President Franklin Roosevelt 3 times between 1933 and 1936, including a goodwill cruise to South America. From November 1933 through 1941, she served as flagship of Scouting Force 1. This was a ship that represented American naval prestige and power, a symbol of the nation's growing strength on the world's oceans. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Indianapolis was at sea and escaped the carnage. From that moment forward, she participated in virtually every major campaign in the Pacific War. Her combat record would eventually earn her 10 battle stars, a testament to her contribution to victory. In March 1942, she participated in the attack on Lae and Salamaua. Through 1942 and 43, she served in the Aleutians Campaign, shelling Kiska and sinking the Japanese cargo ship Akagane Maru. In November 1943, she supported the assault on the Gilbert Islands and the bombardment of Tarawa. In January and February 1944, she participated in the Marshall Islands Campaign and the Kwajalein Operation. In June 1944, she was present at the Marianas Campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In September 1944, she supported the assault on Peleliu. In February 1945, she participated in the first carrier strike on Tokyo since the Doolittle raid and provided support for the Iwo Jima landings. From late 1943, Indianapolis served as flagship of the 5th Fleet under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, one of the most prestigious assignments in the entire Pacific Fleet. She carried the flag of one of America's greatest naval commanders through the decisive battles that pushed Japan ever closer to defeat. On March 31, 1945, during operations off Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze aircraft struck the ship. The plane's bomb punched through the decks and exploded underwater, killing 9 crew members and wounding 26 others. Captain Charles McVeigh skillfully steamed the listing cruiser back to Mare Island Navy Yard in California for repairs. No one knew it at the time, but those repairs would lead directly to the ship's final mission, a mission so secret that most of the crew would never know what they carried until after they were rescued from the sea. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War was entering its final and most desperate phase. American forces had captured Iwo Jima after brutal fighting and were engaged in the bloody campaign for Okinawa. The Japanese had unleashed waves of kamikaze attacks, inflicting devastating casualties on the fleet. Everyone knew that the invasion of the Japanese home islands would be the bloodiest operation of the war. Military planners estimated American casualties could range from 250,000 to over 1 million men. But there was another option, one being developed in absolute secrecy in the deserts of New Mexico. The Manhattan Project had produced the world's first atomic weapons, and the United States was preparing to use them against Japan. The decision would reshape the course of human history. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the Trinity test lit up the New Mexico desert with the first nuclear explosion in human history. That same day, USS Indianapolis departed San Francisco carrying the most secret and important cargo ever transported by sea. While Indianapolis underwent repairs at Mare Island, she had been selected for a mission that came under direct orders from the Commander-in-Chief himself. The mission was to deliver critical components of the atomic bomb known as Little Boy to the Pacific island of Tinian, where it would be loaded aboard a B-29 bomber for the attack on Japan. On July 15, 1945, Army trucks delivered 2 items to the ship at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. The first was a large wooden crate loaded into the port hangar. This crate contained the complete gun assembly mechanism for the Little Boy weapon, along with scientific instruments. The second item was a lead-lined steel canister containing approximately 38.5 kilograms of enriched uranium-235 in disc form. This was the projectile component of the bomb, representing a substantial portion of the American supply of weapons-grade uranium at the time. The canister was secured in the flag lieutenant's quarters, which had been Admiral Spruance's cabin before he transferred his flag to another ship. 2 Manhattan Project representatives traveled aboard the ship disguised as Army artillery officers. Major Robert Furman was an Army engineer responsible for the physical security of the cargo. Dr. James Nolan was the chief medical officer for Los Alamos, a radiologist who would monitor the uranium's radioactivity during the voyage. Nolan used his frequent bouts of seasickness as cover for his visits to check on the container. The crew was told nothing about what they carried. They only knew that 2 Army officers had come aboard with a mysterious crate and canister, and that armed Marine guards were stationed outside the cabin where the canister was stored around the clock. Speculation ran wild through the ship. Some thought they were carrying gold bullion. Others guessed it might be a secret weapon. None came close to the truth. Indianapolis covered the San Francisco to Pearl Harbor leg in 74.5 hours at an average speed of approximately 29 knots. This was a speed record for the route. After a brief refueling stop at Pearl Harbor, she continued at maximum speed to Tinian. On July 26, 1945, Indianapolis arrived at Tinian, and the cargo was unloaded under the observation of high-ranking officers. The total voyage had covered approximately 5,000 nautical miles in just 10 days. The crew never set foot on Tinian and remained ignorant of what they had delivered. By July 29, all 3 shipments of bomb components had reached the island, and assembly of the weapon began on July 30. The connection between Indianapolis and the atomic bomb was direct and critical. On August 6, 1945, just 11 days after the delivery, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The explosion killed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly, with the death toll rising to 140,000 by the end of the year. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15, Japan announced its surrender, ending the most destructive conflict in human history. Ground crews reportedly inscribed on the bomb casing a message that read, "Greetings to the Emperor from the men of the Indianapolis." The crew would not learn what they had carried until after the Hiroshima bombing, while they were recovering in hospital after their rescue from the sea. When they finally understood the nature of their cargo, they realized they had been part of one of the most significant missions in military history. The uranium they had transported across the Pacific had ended the war. After delivering her cargo, Indianapolis sailed from Tinian to Guam, where some crew rotated and new sailors came aboard. On July 28, 1945, she departed Guam for later Gulf in the Philippines, where she was to join Vice Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 95 for gunnery training before the planned invasion of Japan. Captain McVeigh requested a destroyer escort for the voyage. His request was denied. He was told to zigzag at his discretion based on weather and visibility conditions. What he was not told was that American intelligence had detected Japanese submarine activity along his route. Just 4 days earlier, on July 24, the destroyer USS Underhill had been sunk by a Khitan human torpedo launched from a Japanese submarine in nearby waters. This critical intelligence was never passed to Captain McVeigh. The route from Guam to Leyte took Indianapolis through waters that were considered relatively safe. The ship was traveling alone, without escort, at a speed of approximately 17 knots. As night fell on July 29, heavy cloud cover obscured the moon. Captain McVeigh ordered the ship to cease zigzagging around 8 o'clock in the evening, standard procedure given the poor visibility conditions. The captain retired to his emergency sea cabin, leaving the officer of the deck in charge of the bridge. Below decks, most of the 1,200 men aboard were asleep or resting in their bunks. The ship was cruising quietly through the calm tropical waters, her engines humming steadily, her wake phosphorescing in the darkness. The watch changed at midnight. A new group of sailors took their stations. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. In the darkness beneath the sea, the Japanese submarine I-58 was hunting. I-58 was a B-3 type cruiser submarine displacing approximately 2,140 tons. She was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, age 35, one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most skilled torpedo officers. The submarine carried 19 Type 95 torpedoes, 6 Khitan manned suicide torpedoes, and a crew of 101 men. Hashimoto had been at sea for weeks, searching for targets in waters that had become increasingly dangerous for Japanese submarines. At approximately 11 o'clock on the night of July 29, Navigation Officer Lieutenant Tanaka spotted a ship silhouetted against the intermittent moonlight, approaching from the east with no escort. Hashimoto studied the target through his periscope and misidentified her as an Idaho-class battleship, an even larger prize than the heavy cruiser she actually was. He observed the target making a straight course, not zigzagging, and ordered his submarine to submerge for attack. Hashimoto maneuvered I-58 into an optimal firing position at a range of approximately 1,500 yards. At 12:15 in the morning, on July 30, he gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes launched from the submarine's bow tubes in a spread at 3-second intervals. Each torpedo carried approximately 405 to 550 kilograms of Type 97 explosive and traveled at 49 to 51 knots. Unlike American torpedoes, which left visible bubble trails, the Japanese Type 95 was oxygen-powered and left no wake visible in the darkness. 2 torpedoes found their mark. The first torpedo struck approximately 40 feet aft of the bow, detonating the forward powder magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. It blew the entire bow section off the ship, sending a column of water and fire higher than the bridge. The second torpedo struck amidships near crew berthing and the ship's power center. This detonation ignited ammunition magazines and 3,500 gallons of aviation fuel stored nearby. It tore away great sections of the hull bottom and effectively broke the ship's keel. All electrical power was instantly destroyed. Communications were knocked out. Lights went dark throughout the ship. In the engine rooms, men fought to control flooding and fires in total darkness. On the bridge, officers tried to assess the damage, but with no power and no communications, they were operating blind. Indianapolis was still making 17 knots when the torpedoes hit. With her bow gone, the sea poured into the open wound at the front of the ship at tremendous speed. The ship began listing to starboard almost immediately. Within moments, the angle increased from 15 degrees to 45 degrees. Walking became difficult, then impossible. Men trying to climb ladders found themselves sliding back down. Hatches that had been horizontal were now at crazy angles. Captain McVeigh reached the bridge approximately 2 minutes after the explosions. He found the ship already listing heavily to starboard, and the bow section completely gone. He gave the verbal order to pass the word to abandon ship approximately 8 minutes after the torpedoes struck, but with no electrical power, the order could not be broadcast over the ship's announcing system. It had to be passed by word of mouth from man to man through the chaos of a dying ship. In the radio rooms, operators fought to send a distress signal. Radio Room 1 had been destroyed in the explosions. In Radio Room 2, Chief Warrant Officer Leonard Woods stayed at his post, pounding out an SOS on the emergency transmitter. He urged younger radio men to save themselves and get off the ship. Woods went down with Indianapolis, still trying to send a message that might bring help to his shipmates. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, at approximately 12:27, Indianapolis capsized. She rolled over to starboard, her massive hull blocking out the stars. Then she rose up by the stern, her screws lifting into the air, still turning slowly. Men who had been clinging to the port side found themselves walking across the bottom of the ship as she rolled. Some jumped. Some were pulled under by the suction. Some slid down the barnacle-covered hull, their skin torn by the sharp shells. Then she slipped beneath the waves and was gone. Approximately 300 men went down with the ship, trapped below decks, killed by explosions and fires, or caught in the still-turning propellers as they tried to escape. The remaining men, approximately 890, were left floating in the darkness of the Philippine Sea. Most of the life rafts had gone down with the ship. In the chaos of the sinking, only about 12 rafts and 6 floater nets had been released. The vast majority of the survivors had nothing but kapok life jackets, and many did not even have those. There was almost no food, no fresh water, and no medical supplies for the bulk of the men floating in the oil-covered water. The survivors broke into approximately 7 distinct groups, spread across miles of ocean. Some groups would drift as far as 124 miles over the course of their ordeal. The largest group, numbering between 325 and 400 men, was led by Ensign Harlan Twible and included the ship's chief medical officer, Dr. Lewis Haynes. This group had almost no rafts, only life vests and floater nets. They would suffer the heaviest casualties. Captain McVeigh's smaller group of about 10 men was relatively better equipped, having found 3 life rafts with paddles, rations, and signal flares. As dawn broke on July 30, the men in the water took stock of their situation. They were coated in thick black fuel oil that had spread across the surface from the sunken ship. The oil burned their eyes and skin and made breathing difficult. Many had swallowed oil during the night and were vomiting, but the oil may have also saved some lives. It would provide some protection from the sun and may have deterred some shark attacks in the early hours. The water temperature was approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent rapid hypothermia but devastating over days of constant immersion. The tropical sun beat down during the day, causing severe sunburn on any exposed skin, heat stroke, and accelerating dehydration. At night, temperatures dropped enough to cause shivering and hypothermia. The constant cycling between extremes was relentless. There was no fresh water. The men's kapok life jackets kept them afloat, but offered no other protection. They could not swim because the life jackets restricted their movement. They could not rest because there was nothing to rest on. They could only float, hour after hour, day after day, waiting for rescue that they had to believe would come. By the second day, dehydration began to take its toll. Men's lips cracked and swelled. Their tongues became thick and coated. The craving for water became overwhelming. And surrounding them on all sides was water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Some of the younger sailors, boys of 17 and 18 on their first ship, could not resist. They began drinking the seawater. The effects were devastating. Seawater contains approximately 3.5% salt, far more than the human body can process. Drinking it causes severe diarrhea, which accelerates dehydration rather than relieving it. The kidneys struggle to process the excess salt and begin to shut down. Confusion sets in, followed by delirium, mania, and death. Dr. Haynes, paddling among the groups, checking on men, could identify those who had drunk salt water by looking in their eyes. The pupils would dilate and become unfocused. Within hours, those men would be dead. By the second and third days, mass hallucinations began sweeping through the groups. Men became convinced that the ship was just beneath the surface, with working drinking fountains and open mess halls serving food. Survivor Woody Eugene James later recalled that some of the guys who had been drinking salt water were going berserk. They would tell big stories about how the Indianapolis was not really sunk, it was just right there under the surface. They would say they had just been down there and had a drink of water from the drinking fountain and the ship's store was still open. 3 or 4 guys would believe these stories and swim down with them, never to return. Fights broke out. Men attacked each other, convinced that Japanese soldiers had infiltrated the group. Some simply gave up. They unbuckled their life jackets, said goodbye to their friends, and slipped beneath the water. Others were too weak to hold on any longer and drowned when their waterlogged kapok jackets could no longer keep their heads above water. And then there were the sharks. The sharks arrived within hours of the sinking, drawn by the explosions, the blood in the water, and the thrashing of hundreds of men. The primary species was the oceanic whitetip, a pelagic open-ocean predator known for arriving first at maritime disasters. Oceanic whitetips are bold, persistent, and fearless around humans. Tiger sharks and possibly blue sharks were also present. Initially, the sharks fed on the floating dead and the severely wounded, but by the first full day, attacks on living survivors began to escalate, especially against men who were isolated, bleeding, or separated from the main groups. Survivor Woody James described the pattern. The day wore on and the sharks were around, hundreds of them. You would hear guys scream, especially late in the afternoon. It seemed like the sharks were worse late in the afternoon than during the day. Then they fed at night too. Everything would be quiet, and then you would hear somebody scream, and you knew a shark had got him. The attacks followed a terrible pattern. A man would become delirious from saltwater poisoning and swim away from his group, convinced he was swimming toward the ship or toward an island. He would get 50 to 75 yards away. Then a blood-curdling scream would echo across the water. The men would see the kapok life jacket go under. Then, like a fishing bobber, the kapok would bring the body back up. But by then the blood had attracted more sharks, and they would fight over what remained. The survivors organized shark watches. They stayed in tight groups, knowing the sharks generally avoided the larger clusters and targeted stragglers. Men kicked and splashed at approaching sharks. They pushed corpses away from the group to divert the predators. One group opened a can of Spam from a raft and was immediately swarmed by sharks attracted by the smell of food. They learned to discard anything that might attract the hunters circling below. The exact number killed by sharks will never be known. It is impossible to distinguish between men who died of other causes and were then consumed by sharks and those killed directly by attacks. Estimates range from a few dozen to approximately 150. However, historians emphasize that the majority of deaths in the water were from exposure, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning, not from sharks. The shark attacks, while genuinely horrific for some groups, varied enormously depending on which group a survivor was in. While the men of Indianapolis fought for survival in the water, an almost incomprehensible failure was unfolding in the Navy's command structure. Nobody was looking for them. The Navy used operations plotting boards to track ship movements, but the system relied on predictions rather than actual reports. A directive known as Pacific Fleet Confidential Letter 10CL45, issued in January 1945, explicitly stated that arrival reports shall not be made for combatant ships. This was intended to reduce radio traffic that might be intercepted by the enemy, but the directive was interpreted to mean that non-arrivals also need not be reported. When Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on July 31 as scheduled, she was simply removed from one plotting board and incorrectly recorded as having arrived on another. The operations officer at Tacloban, Lieutenant Stuart Gibson, knew Indianapolis had not arrived on schedule but failed to investigate or report it. He assumed she had been diverted to other duties. No one raised an alarm. No one asked where the ship was. No one thought to look for nearly 900 men who had vanished from the face of the earth. The failure was compounded by allegations that distress signals may have been received, but were not acted upon. Survivors and witnesses later maintained that shore stations received SOS messages from Indianapolis, but none responded. According to some accounts, one commanding officer was reportedly intoxicated, another had ordered his men not to disturb him, and a third dismissed the signals as a Japanese deception designed to lure American ships into a trap. The Navy's own post-war investigation found no conclusive evidence that any distress signal got through, attributing the communication failure to the fortunes of war. The truth may never be known with certainty. For 84 hours, the men floated and died while the Navy went about its business, as if nothing had happened. At approximately 11:25 in the morning on August 2, 1945, after roughly 84 hours in the water, the survivors were spotted entirely by accident. Lieutenant Junior Grade Wilbur Chuck Gwynn, a Naval Reserve pilot from Patrol Bombing Squadron 152 based at Peleliu, was flying his PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol when an antenna weight fell off inside the aircraft. Crawling into the underbelly to secure the loose antenna, Gwynn looked down through the observation window and spotted a miles-long oil slick on the surface of the sea. Assuming it was from a damaged Japanese submarine, he descended to 300 feet to begin a bombing run. Then he saw irregular bumps on the surface, groups of men, clinging together in the oil. Gwynn immediately radioed his discovery. "Many men in the water," his message read. The rescue operation began. Lieutenant Commander George Atterbury, Gwynn's squadron commander, flew out to relieve him and guide rescue aircraft to the scene. Lieutenant R. Adrian Marks and his crew received orders to fly their PBY-5A Catalina flying boat from Peleliu to the location. En route, Marks overflew the destroyer escort, USS Cecil J. Doyle, and radioed her captain, Lieutenant Commander W. Graham Claytor Jr., who on his own initiative changed course and headed for the survivors at maximum speed. What Marks saw from the air changed the entire rescue operation. He spotted men being attacked by sharks. He saw lone survivors drifting helplessly away from the main groups. He made an extraordinary decision. He would disobey standing orders against open ocean landings in a seaplane. Marks put his Catalina down in 12-foot swells, risking the lives of his entire crew. The impact damaged the aircraft's hull, but she stayed afloat. Marks taxied through oil-covered water and began picking up survivors, prioritizing the isolated stragglers most vulnerable to shark attack. When the interior of the aircraft was full, he began lashing survivors to the wings with parachute cord. By the time he was done, he had rescued 56 men. His aircraft would never fly again. Just after midnight on August 3, USS Cecil J. Doyle became the first surface vessel on scene. Captain Claytor made a courageous decision. He ordered his searchlights turned on as a beacon for the men in the water, despite the risk that the lights might attract Japanese submarines. For the men who had been in the water for 4 days, those lights were the first sign that rescue had finally come. The rescue itself was a race against time. Many of the survivors were too weak to help themselves. They had to be lifted bodily from the water by sailors who climbed down cargo nets and lowered themselves into the sea. Some survivors were so covered in oil and so badly sunburned that rescuers could not tell where their clothing ended and their skin began. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat men suffering from severe dehydration, shark bites, burns, broken bones, and psychological trauma. Some survivors had to be restrained because they were still hallucinating and did not understand they were being rescued. 6 additional ships joined the search. USS Bassett rescued approximately 152 survivors, the most by any single ship. USS Register and USS Ringness each rescued approximately 37 men. USS Ralph Talbot pulled 22 from the water. USS Dufilio rescued 1 man who had drifted far from the main groups. Captain McVeigh was among the last survivors recovered, pulled aboard the Ringness. Search operations continued through August 8, combing a 100-mile radius. No living survivors were found after August 3. Ships recovering bodies reported remains badly mutilated by sharks. The crew of USS Helm had to fire rifles at the sharks to drive them away from remains before they could be recovered. When the final count was made, the toll was devastating. Of the 1,195 men aboard Indianapolis when she sailed from Guam, only 316 survived. 879 men had perished, making it the single greatest loss of life from a single ship in United States Navy history. Approximately 300 men went down with the ship. The remaining 580 died in the water from injuries sustained in the torpedo explosions, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, exposure, drowning, shark attacks, hallucination-induced drowning, and violence from delirious shipmates. 2 rescued survivors, Robert Lee Shipman and Frederick Harrison, died en route to hospital in August 1945 from their injuries. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Navy needed someone to blame. They chose Captain Charles McVay. Charles Butler McVay III was born August 31, 1898, in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. He came from a distinguished Navy family. His father, Admiral Charles Butler McVay, Jr., had served as navigator of the flagship USS Alabama and commanded the dispatch boat Yankton during the Great White Fleet's global cruise, later serving as commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet. The younger McVay received a presidential appointment to the Naval Academy from President Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and graduated with the accelerated class of 1920 in June 1919. McVay's career before Indianapolis was exemplary. He had earned the Silver Star for heroism aboard USS Cleveland in the Solomon Islands in March 1943. He had served in the office of the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. He took command of Indianapolis on November 18, 1944, and led her through the Tokyo raids, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. A Navy Court of Inquiry convened on Guam on August 13, 1945, just 9 days after the rescue. The inquiry recommended that McVay face charges. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz disagreed. He called McVay's failure to zigzag at worst an error in judgment and not gross negligence. Admiral Raymond Spruance, under whose flag Indianapolis had served, also opposed prosecution. But Fleet Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, overruled Nimitz. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal directed that a court-martial be convened. The court-martial took place at the Washington Navy Yard from December 3 through December 19, 1945. McVay faced 2 charges. The first was failure to order abandoned ship in a timely manner. The second was hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. In an extraordinary and unprecedented move, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the enemy submarine commander who had sunk Indianapolis, was flown from Japan to testify. Hashimoto confirmed that Indianapolis had not been zigzagging, but he also testified that zigzagging would have made no change in the outcome. He was in such a favorable position that he would have sunk the ship regardless. Captain Glyn Donahoe, a 4-time Navy Cross recipient and experienced American submarine commander, corroborated this testimony. He stated that he had sunk many zigzagging ships during the war and that the tactic was of negligible value against a determined submarine attack. McVay was acquitted of failure to order timely abandoned ship, but he was convicted of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. The court unanimously recommended clemency. His sentence, loss of seniority numbers, was subsequently remitted in its entirety by Secretary Forrestal on Nimitz's recommendation. McVay was restored to duty. McVay was the only commanding officer in the entire history of the United States Navy to be court-martialed for losing a ship to enemy action in wartime. More than 700 American vessels were lost during World War II. None of their captains were court-martialed. Survivors and historians widely believe the trial was designed to deflect attention from the Navy's catastrophic procedural failures that left nearly 900 men in the water for 4 days. McVay retired on June 30, 1949, and was promoted to Rear Admiral upon retirement based on his combat citations. But for years he received relentless hate mail from families of the dead. One letter read, "Merry Christmas. Our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you had not killed my son." Such letters arrived on birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries of the sinking. The harassment was relentless. Some families blamed McVay for the deaths of their loved ones, not understanding that it was the Navy's failures, not the captain's decisions, that had condemned so many men to die in the water. McVay carried the weight of those deaths for the rest of his life. He remarried and tried to build a peaceful retirement, but the memories never faded. He attended survivor reunions and maintained friendships with men who had served under him. The survivors themselves never blamed their captain. They knew he had done everything possible to save them, and that the real failures lay elsewhere in the chain of command. On November 6, 1968, at age 70, at his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, Charles McVay took his own life with a service revolver. He left no note. His ashes were scattered at sea in the Gulf of Mexico. The campaign for McVay's exoneration began decades later, sparked by an unlikely champion. In 1996, an 11-year-old student named Hunter Scott from Pensacola, Florida, watched the movie Jaws. He was captivated by Captain Quint's monologue about the Indianapolis and asked his father if that was a true story. For his 6th grade National History Day project, Scott interviewed nearly 150 survivors and reviewed over 800 documents. His research caught the attention of Congressman Joe Scarborough, leading to congressional hearings in September 1999 before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Commander Hashimoto, then elderly, wrote a letter to Senator John Warner. "Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war and its consequences," he wrote. "Perhaps it is time your peoples forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction." Hashimoto died on October 25, 2000, at age 91. On October 30, 2000, President Bill Clinton signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which included a sense of Congress resolution declaring McVeigh's court-martial charges not morally sustainable and his conviction a miscarriage of justice. The resolution stated that McVeigh's record should reflect that he is exonerated for the loss of USS Indianapolis. In July 2001, Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, formally entered the exoneration into McVeigh's official service record, affirming his lack of culpability. Hunter Scott went on to graduate from the University of North Carolina on a Naval ROTC scholarship and became a United States naval aviator flying MH-60R Seahawk helicopters. For 72 years, Indianapolis lay undiscovered on the floor of the Philippine Sea. Previous search efforts failed partly because the ship rests over 3 miles down, but also because they were looking in the wrong place. The official sinking coordinates were approximately 40 miles off from where the ship actually went down. The breakthrough came from Dr. Richard Hulver of the Naval History and Heritage Command, who in July 2016 found records from tank landing ship LST-779. These records indicated that the landing ship had passed by Indianapolis approximately 11 hours before the torpedoing. This data point revealed that the cruiser had been traveling faster and farther west than previously assumed, narrowing the search area from approximately 3,000 square miles to about 600 square miles. Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, a billionaire philanthropist and son of a World War II veteran, funded the expedition through his company Vulcan Incorporated. His research vessel, RV Petrel, measuring 250 feet in length and equipped with advanced, remotely operated vehicles with high-definition cameras, conducted the search. On August 19, 2017, the team announced they had located the wreck at a depth of approximately 18,000 feet in the Philippine Sea, between Guam and Palau. The hull, number 35, painted on the stern, provided the first visual confirmation. The wreck was remarkably well preserved at the extreme depth. Naval historian Robert Nealand noted that the paint was still in place, including on the anchor where the word Norfolk could still be read. Supply boxes clearly marked Indianapolis were visible. The main wreck sits in an enormous impact crater on the ocean floor. The bow, blown off before sinking, lies 1.5 miles east of the main hull section. The 2 forward 8-inch gun turrets, which broke free on the surface, rest 1/2 mile to the east. The stern turret remains in place, though collapsed. Allen stated that to be able to honor the brave men of Indianapolis through the discovery of a ship that played such a significant role in ending World War II was truly humbling. Survivor Arthur Lieneman, age 93 at the time, said he was very happy they had found it. It had been a long 72 years coming. Indianapolis remains United States Navy property and is protected by law as a war grave site. Her precise coordinates remain classified to protect the site from unauthorized salvage. The testimonies of Indianapolis survivors constitute some of the most powerful oral histories of the Second World War. Marine Corporal Giles McCoy, who had survived the Battle of Peleliu before joining Indianapolis, described escaping from below decks after the torpedo explosions. The blast knocked the bunks on top of him. Up above, they were yelling to get out because they were sealing the hatches. Once those hatches are sealed, they become tombs. We kept hollering for more time because there were more men down there. One of the most remarkable encounters in the story occurred at Pearl Harbor in December 1990, during ceremonies marking the 49th anniversary of the Japanese attack. McCoy approached Commander Hashimoto through an interpreter. He told the Japanese commander that he felt Hashimoto had been doing his duty just as the American sailors had been doing theirs. He told Hashimoto that he forgave him. Hashimoto replied that he forgave McCoy too. When McCoy asked what for, Hashimoto explained that the bomb McCoy's ship delivered to Tinian was dropped on his hometown, Hiroshima, and it killed his family. As of early 2026, one survivor of Indianapolis remains alive. Harold Bray Jr. was 18 years old when he went into the water on July 30, 1945. He was among the youngest members of the crew. He is now 98 years old and lives in California. Bray has described what it was like to slide off the sinking ship into the darkness. With the moon being really bright that night, you could still see people jumping off the ship. It was like ants coming off a stick, he recalled. On the sharks, he said they were there, and he was bumped a couple of times, but they were not hungry at the time he supposed. Of his group of 18 men, guys died every day. By the time they were picked up, only 2 or 3 were left. In 2023, Bray wrote a letter to the last surviving crewman of I-58. He extended his hand in friendship and said that he bore no ill will toward the Japanese or their countrymen. "We both fought for our countries," he wrote. "There are no winners in a war." On December 20, 2018, the crew of Indianapolis was collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress. The medal is now permanently displayed at the Indiana War Memorial Museum in Indianapolis. The sinking of USS Indianapolis stands as one of the greatest tragedies in American naval history, not only because of the 879 men who died, but because so many of those deaths were preventable. The ship was sent unescorted through submarine-infested waters without being warned of known Japanese activity. The Navy's tracking system failed to notice she was missing for nearly 4 days. Whether distress signals were sent and ignored remains disputed to this day. A decorated captain was court-martialed while the institutional failures that killed his men went largely unpunished. Indianapolis completed the most important naval mission of the war, delivering the weapon that would end the conflict and save potentially millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. Her crew paid for that mission with their lives, dying in the water, while the Navy that sent them there failed to look for them. The men who served aboard Indianapolis were fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. They ranged in age from 17 to over 40. Some were veteran sailors who had been aboard for years. Others were fresh from training, on their first ship. They were ready to fight and willing to sacrifice for their country. They expected to face the enemy in battle. They did not expect to be abandoned in the sea for 4 days while sharks circled and their friends died around them. Their story deserves to be remembered, not to glorify war, but to honor those who served, and to remind us that even in victory, there is tragedy. The weapons of war are powerful and necessary, but they exact a terrible price. And sometimes the greatest failures are not on the battlefield, but in the bureaucratic systems that are supposed to protect the men who fight. 879 men remain forever in the Philippine Sea, their final resting place now located but still undisturbed 3 miles beneath the waves. They delivered the bomb that ended the war. They should have come home as heroes. Instead, they became the victims of the greatest disaster in United States naval history. We remember them,